Welcome to all those who are attending this series of ours, Conversations With. My name is James Bagg. I'm chairman of Bvalco. 9 years ago, with my co-director, Gill, we set up Bvalco to help boards of all organizations, both public and private, profit-making and charitable, to work more effectively together. And in a moment, it will be my pleasure to hand you over to Alison, to introduce and conduct our conversation today with Colin Tenwick. Now, on LinkedIn yesterday, I messaged all non-executive directors, defying any of them not to listen in, given the enormous challenges presented by the advance of information technologies upon which so many of our businesses now critically depend. And I can think of no one better placed than Colin to give a view on this. Now, we're going to be recording this conversation and we will be publishing some segments of it, and that will be made available to everyone on YouTube and the Bvalco website. Please, during the conversation, I encourage you to raise any questions you may have via the Q&A feature. And if you want to use the chat facility, please will you identify who you are. So without further ado, and with much pleasure, I hand you over to Ali.
Thanks, James. Well, welcome to everybody, and welcome particularly to Colin. Thank you very much for agreeing to join a conversation with me this afternoon. Just by way of introduction, really, I'm just really genuinely pleased to have you here. You have so much experience as a chair and board advisor. Fascinating businesses that you've been involved in, from Stepzone to Booker Table to Alison Lead Taxis, auction technology. It's quite a list, and I hope that you'll be able to share some stories with us today of your sort of journey with those businesses. It seems to me that there are two things that strike me about your portfolio. One is that all the businesses you're involved in seem to be really transforming the way we work and the way we do things, and that they're all growth businesses. So real kind of interested to hear about how you select those businesses and the the sort of stages of different journeys that you've been on with them. So welcome and thank you, Colin.
Thank you very much.
Just quickly, I'm Gill, I'm the CEO of Bvalco, and the way we're going to run the session today is I'm going to have a sort of conversation with Colin, really, and try and get him to share some stories about his work with the boards that he's been on, with the businesses that I've just discussed, and then open the floor to questions. But of course, as we go, if you do have questions that are relevant to the topics we're talking about, just put them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up. And this is really about you as the audience and getting what you want from the conversation. So please do start as soon as you can by firing questions in our direction, so that we can make sure that Colin answers your questions as well as mine. Colin, let's get started. Tell me what the characteristics of a scale-up business are.
And I think the important thing is they are very different to a scale down business, and the skills that require for that are very different. So on a scale up, to me, when we talk about scale up, typically they are businesses that already have a sort of a proven business model, in the fact that it's revenue generating, it has proven value to certain customers, but it may be that the opportunity for that is significantly larger. The market opportunity to expand could be considerably greater. And what's important is that scale-up opportunity can be achieved in multiple ways, and whether that's focusing more of the same, which is expanding the number of customers with a very clear expectation, or it's actually working on what I call different growth vectors, and those growth vectors could be geographic expansion, it could be vertical expansion, it could be horizontal. So it's a proven business model with a management team typically that is taking it to a certain level, where there is a requirement for and an opportunity for much faster or extensive growth. reaching a point where the requirement for either additional capital, sources of capital, and real ambition of the management team are sort of coming together, and they are the opportunities that that I tend to get involved in and have got involved in or have identified. But they aren't just purely a single, let's say, technology play. We talk about technology-enabled businesses, and so for me, the way I describe it is it's very much a pivot point. Technology becomes the pivot point that enables those businesses then to expand and grow, possibly in a direction that the founders weren't necessarily thinking at the time, but become available and are identified as you go through that journey.
Okay, so you're sort of looking, the proven business model seems to be really important, but I guess arguably most businesses these days are technology enabled or could be technology enabled. So can we delve into that a bit more? You know, how do you decide whether a technology is going to be the pivotal point?
And the starting point for me is very often, you know, the ambition of the management team, and you know that can be manifest itself in many different ways. It may actually manifest itself in that the management team says, we know this is the route we need to go to, the market is telling us or our customers are telling us, but actually we don't have the wherewithal to be able to do that, or we need a clearer path to do that. Or it may be that that there is a business with some, you know, very interesting assets which can be transitioned and transformed into a sort of new sector. So you're right, most businesses have an element of technology. You know, if you look at where growth comes from today, it has to become a core part pretty much of every business. But it's the degree to which you do that and degree which you can try and marry that with, let's say, the more traditional elements. And I think, you know, that's the subtlety that is required, because you know, it's not just about mimicking somebody's business model. It is about taking what makes that company or opportunity exciting and unique, and combining that with some very well proven examples out there in the marketplace or around us. And so that very often are the ingredients that can make a very interesting company truly great.
I mean, and so from a sort of technology, you've described kind of a couple of scenarios, really. One where the management team can see that they need the tech, you know, they're excited by the technology, presumably they're skilled in terms of the technology, and another where actually they think the business needs technology, but perhaps they haven't got the right skills. And I imagine that as someone with your background, describe a bit about how you might assess the capability of the management team to actually, you know, drive that sort of transformation, and particularly, I guess as well, the capability of the board, because a lot of boards struggle with this sort of technology enablement, don't they?
They do, and I think there are a number of, I would say, sort of you know, basic tenets that you can look at. One of the things I always tend to look at is the relationship in the organisation between the sort of triumvirate of what I call, you know, is product and what product is actually looking like, and product in its broadest sense, and how people determine the product and how people articulate about the product, how that links with analytics in a I would say in a data-rich environment, and how analytics actually get built into the core part in which decision making are being made in a business, and tech, and those three areas in a well integrated technology enabled business, they are very often the areas which actually require significant new investment, or actually in some cases starting from scratch in a more traditional business. So I look at people's opinion on those and the skill sets that sit around those, and clearly when you're talking to the senior management, the CEOs and the C-level executives, it's how are they viewing the inputs from those core parts to the other parts of the business, which may be the go-to-market side, the you know, finance side, and how they measure, etc. So that's a good starting point. When you then look at the board skills, then it's about assembling the board skills that support the business strategy and can bring added value to that. And so again, around the technology enablement part, I think there's a key area. I think around customer engagement is a key area. And then it's whether if you're looking at international growth or whether you look at vertical integration, M&A, et cetera, whatever those key building blocks become, ideally you want a board that is able to add value in each of those areas to that team.
Yeah, and a lot of the boards that you sit on are private or businesses, sorry, private equity backed.
Yeah.
Say the board structures are a little bit different. Might you say a little bit about that and some of your experiences?
I mean, I've sort of been involved in public boards and private, and also I've been involved in a couple of continental two-tier supervisory boards, which are fundamentally different again. And each of them has a different way of playing. I think if you look at the private equity model, it is a cleaner model in some respects, in that the linkage between the major shareholders, which very often can be multiple. They could be founders, they could be numbers of investors, and management becomes more clearly aligned in certain respects. And what you tend to do is lean quite heavily on the expertise and the consultants that can be brought to bear in terms of your board makeup. If you look at a public company, it is different, because purely in terms of the legal responsibilities, particularly of a one-tier board, are fundamentally different. But also, you are looking to clearly have the role of the various committees is much stronger, and the need to have those committees providing true transparency and governance is also very important. So there is a subtle difference. Fundamentally, the roles as a director are the same in certain respects. The degree at which the level of touch you use very often will change depending on the circumstances of those businesses.
Do you have a preference?
Sorry?
Do you have a preference?
When I was the CEO of a public company, we were able to use the public markets very successfully to support the business, raise additional financing, M&A work, etc. And so that worked very successfully. There is an overhead engaged with that, and so the C-level executives would spend a proportion of their time working with those shareholders. So I think in the private equity market, there is more focus on the business because you don't have as much shareholder impact or engagement, if you will. But it's horses for courses. I think one of the wonderful things about our markets today is if you're a management team, your access to sources of capital probably has never been greater in terms of different types of capital for the jobs that is required for businesses. And we've seen a resurgence, certainly in the last 12 months or so in the public markets. But I think there's been a dearth of good quality businesses coming to the market. That seems to be reaching a little bit more of a balance. So I think the choices available today are probably greater than ever before, but they do come with a difference in terms of requirements.
Yeah. So obviously you get invited to chair a business, a growth business. What sort of things are you looking at? What are the kind of typical growth pains that you tend to experience and the stages that perhaps the businesses go through?
Well, I think a lot of them are you see the management. Typically, you get visibility of the management plan, and you get an idea of where they think the business will be in 3 to 5 years' time. And the key focus becomes trying to tether that view in, let's say, 3 years. How do you tether that view with reality? And so you get this view where everybody thinks everything goes exponentially. Every single investment, every single company I've ever been involved in, the line doesn't go like that. There are bumps in the road. And so it's understanding how do you tether that growth strategy to a sense of reality. Is the market opportunity significant enough to meet the demands? Is there a shift required in the business to actually go after certain markets? The skill sets typically in the management team are the ones that require really looking at in terms of during that stage of growth. It's quite rare to have the same team managing all the way through that growth strategy. You do need to complement that and bring some new skills in, and that also means that you can bring in blended skills. People have got experience elsewhere, and that can actually bring a slightly different view onto some of these businesses. Clearly, you're looking at M&A. M&A does tend to play an important role in a lot of these growth opportunities. But many companies fail to understand that you need to have a platform for M&A if you're going to really benefit from the economies of scale. And so actually buying the business is pretty easy, integrating the businesses and then driving the economies through to the bottom line. That's the challenging part. And very often people underestimate both the timing of doing that and also, again, the sheer amount of hard work that requires. And technology, again, is a core building platform there. If you have a good view as to what are the key systems that you're going to be putting into an M&A platform such that you get visibility of the business and you can put your KPIs across the whole business as soon as possible, they are things that add real value. The one area that a lot of people don't spend enough time on, funnily enough, is also, what's the cultural fit going to be? And if you are using M&A as a means of building rather than organic growth, actually you're melding together typically cultures, and it has to be, in my experience, a win-win solution. You have to have winners on both sides of an M&A process, and so these are things that sometimes you have to spend more time on, and that's an area where often I think the board can add real value, because very often that's where the experience that you're looking to bring can shine light on some of these things.
So interesting, you're describing your role very much in terms of chairing the business as really leaning into the management team and getting under the skin of the actual reality of the business model, the reality of their ambitions, and then using the board to really sort of uncover that kind of reality and get a sense of purpose that can weather the highs and lows that you've described.
Yeah, I would say that is typically, let's say, a growth equity, private equity approach. Typically, I think arguably with a lot of the things that we have seen, let's say over the last 2 years or so in the public markets, arguably with the increased visibility that directors and responsibility that directors are having to take, arguably that will become more of the modus operandi in public companies as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen board directors in the last few months having to get really under the skin of the business models in a way they never did before. Yeah. Quite striking, the number of directors that have said to me they've got a much better understanding of the financial levers now than they did at the start of COVID, which has got to be reassuring, I think, for shareholders and regulators. So just I'm fascinated to hear some stories from some of the businesses that you've been involved in. I mean, you were involved in Red Hat, the open source technology business. That sounded like quite an interesting journey.
Yeah, I mean, Red Hat was, for those of listening that aren't aware, I mean, Red Hat was this company that was founded on this crazy idea of free software, on the open source movement. Now, open source today is one of the most common and proven ways in which people believe you can build better technology and deliver it faster, etc. But back when I got involved, you had Microsoft and you had Oracle and SAP and these companies, and it was all proprietary software. So, you paid a big license fee, and there was an element that you were then wedded to that platform, and you hitched your wagons to that platform for the rest of your company's sort of evolution, or trying to swap out was extraordinarily difficult. So open source was about basically harnessing every single individual on a common cause, but enabling people to peer review and to look at technology, to deliver technology which was free, i.e. anybody could use it. The key thing was that you put back in what you developed. And so it started to raise some very, very interesting intellectual challenges about how do you then monetize? How does a business start to make money on that basis? And so Red Hat was the very first major, I think, company that tried to harness and did harness it very successfully, this business model. We started off by making a distribution operating system which we sold in retail, and so that was a very traditional way of trying to sell somebody a better packaged product. But very rapidly it became the norm, essentially for powering the internet. And I remember when I joined Red Hat, which was very early in the days, one of our very, very first customers was Google, which I think Google at that time probably had about 50 employees or 60 employees, and was using Red Hat as their key operating platform. And it became clear that it was actually about the value add and the security and assurity that you could bring to your technology, which enabled people to want to use that proven distribution. But in return, Red Hat was probably one of the biggest contributors back to the community. So an enormous amounts of resource went back in. So it really was a brand new business model at that time, which had been bubbling under for some time. They were the first real company to commercialize it. And clearly it's then gone on. It was acquired a few years ago by IBM for multiple billions, but it was a brand new business model. But intellectually, an extraordinary challenge, and having to rework all the, I would say, norms that we saw in the technology industry. So that was a classic case of something starting from very small beginnings that became an extraordinarily successful platform. But actually that way of doing business is now pretty much seen as probably the most effective and one of the fastest ways that you can scale businesses. So that was that experience, yeah.
And a fantastic purpose-led organization.
Yeah, and interesting, AVG, which was the other sort of big antivirus software company that I was on the board of, which we listed on the New York Stock Exchange. That was one of the very, very first and probably one of the most successful freemium models. So giving something away for free, where you had hundreds of millions of users worldwide, but then being able to add value on top of that, which people were therefore prepared to pay for. And I suppose if you look at those two business models, both of those are things that can be applied to multiple businesses if you just stand back and think about how could you apply that to a business model.
Yeah, an interesting question here from Frank Bennett. Can you ask Colin to talk about the dilemma of the executive team focusing on building revenue and profit versus directing time to raise finance? Yeah. And what's the tipping?
Yeah. I think, and again, to me, this in my experience, this has different impacts at different stages of a business. In the venture world model is one where, on a fast growth business, companies almost are in, the CFO and the CEO seem to be spending disordinate amounts of time raising money, because the money comes in at a valuation level and the whole model is based on an ever increasing value coming through. So I use the term, it's little and often, and so you're on a constant raising money, which I do think challenges the management team. If you move up the scale slightly into the growth equity marketplace, then you're still raising money, but you're tending to raise it on a more secure business model, and the chunks that you're raising can be different. And then if you get into the private equity model, that again is different. So you tend to spend less time having to source funds as you move up and as the business model gets proven. But at the early stage, even if you go before that and it's angel financing and whatever, it's really hard. And at that stage of a business, cash is absolutely king. And so, there's a disordinate focus on the management and the board on what the cash position of the company is. And I think, the COVID situation we've been through in the last 18 months really exemplified that. I mean, the focus on cash, making sure sources of cash and the negotiations with the banks, etc., which by the way, on the whole, have been extraordinarily supportive, I think, to our industries overall. But it is about securing that cash to enable the business to continue to trade. So it is a challenge, there's no doubt. And part of the board's responsibility has to be to try and balance that and to try and take, where possible, some of that load off.
And then do you tend to build into your board people with that? So, I mean, how often in these sort of rapidly growing businesses do you change the membership of your board?
That's a very good question. And I think, if you look back, there's probably examples where we should have changed some of the people earlier than we did. But in reality, as to a point we were talking about earlier on, it takes a little bit longer for people to get up to speed with the business. If you're not in it every single day, if you're in it just 2 or 3 days a month or whatever the requirement is, it takes a while for you to get up to speed. But I do think that having clear reviews of the board is really important. Clear reviews of how they're performing, and clear open discussions about what skill sets you're looking for. That enables you to do that refresh in a systematic, but also, I think, a fair way. But I do think it's something that is a good process to get involved in.
Yeah. Okay. Just a question here from Peter. Thank you, Peter. What are the particular challenges faced by boards when assessing AI? Do you have any views on how boards can best mitigate this risk?
It's an interesting. Are you talking about AI as a risk or AI as an opportunity? And there's also quite a lot of fluff floating around about AI in terms of, in certainly my experience, if you get the CTO in to do his update, possibly to the board, and there's lots of discussion about machine learning and how that's operating. Clearly, it's important that you have people around the table that are able to assess the reality of some of this, but also to understand what the impacts and proposed impacts are. And fundamentally, when you boil it down, you're talking about a more efficient and effective means of delivering something, whether that's a product, service. It means you're reducing your support levels, you're increasing your productivity level, whatever it is. Ultimately, there should be something there that you can hang a measurement on, and you can discuss with management about what their expectations are of bringing that into their products, whatever. If you're looking at it from a risk perspective, then I would argue the same thing, because a competitor that is investing very heavily in AI, you've got to understand what is it they're trying to achieve from that, and what does that actually mean in terms of the dynamic of the structure of their business. And 9 times out of 10, it is about being able to deliver something more efficiently, more effectively, and faster than you're able to under your current structure. And if you understand those risks, you can then discuss what your response needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me with a lot of the boards that I work with, that many board directors really struggle with the technology transformation because they don't have sufficient understanding, and often the CTO will come into the boardroom and provide what can be quite a confusing propositional proposal, and it seems like the board really struggles to get to grips with actually how to translate that into something which is overseeable by the board or even by different committees.
Yeah.
What tips do you have for that, for dealing with that situation?
Well, again, I think so. There's a couple of areas. I mean, there's always the fallback position of getting somebody in to do a review and give you an update. And let's face it, there's whole industries that do terribly well over that. The reality is, you probably want something a little bit more permanent than that. And so, what you need is the ability for, as I touched on earlier, the board to be able to clearly transition and transact the projects that are being undertaken with what the outcomes are, and all of those outcomes. should have something alongside them. Now, some of them may be, best guesstimate. They may be real bleeding edge, R&D work. But you need to try and make sure that the management team are in a position to be able to articulate what that is going to do to the business, and therefore what is it going to do for shareholders. And I think that's the bit that very often gets missed. But that's no different to any product development. The product development has to have an end result, and that end result can either be, well, very often you hear people say, well, we're just remaining, competitive. All our competitors are doing this, we have to do it. That's one that should be clearly challenged, because that tends to indicate that there's been an underinvestment or lack of vision in the past. But going forward, if you think it's going to provide competitive advantage, then again, you need to tether that to, I think, some key KPIs, and be prepared to change those, but at least have the visibility and transparency that you can discuss it.
Yeah. Okay.
But having people having people on the board that understand those concepts is probably your starting point, which may not be the case for every company.
Yeah, I guess, and also finding people with understanding of those key concepts is a big challenge, isn't it, currently? Yeah. Now, you're involved in some pretty interesting businesses at the moment. Auctioning. Talk a little bit about auction technology. Now, auctioning is something that's it's become so digital over the last few years, but transforming that industry, I imagine, has been quite
yeah. I was involved with Auction Technology Group, which recently floated. I had stepped down from the board just over a year ago, so before that. But the journey that we got involved in there was taking a business that was built to support the traditional auction marketplace, and move that into one where essentially a technology-enabled platform, which also was able to start attracting increasing numbers of people to be able to search for, source, and buy these products. It started off originally in the arts and antiques marketplace, and in fact, the business was a publisher, and it still publishes the Antiques Trade Gazette. So that's where it started off. The management team built the first generations of an auction platform, but very much aimed at auctioneers and providing productivity for auctioneers. And then ultimately, that platform, it was clear that there's a way of buying and sourcing all sorts of things was very applicable. So we built a tech platform which was able to support and source multiple markets. So arts and antiques, secondhand industrial equipment, but both geographically in the US, in Europe, Germany, UK. So many of those growth vectors that I talked about early on, we were able to execute. And literally everything from an auctioneer in West Sussex who had, this is one of the examples that the company uses, had a Mari war club, which it thought would sell for £200 to £300, went online and was bought internationally for in excess of £150,000, because you were selling to and marketing to a worldwide audience. Right the way through to the other extreme was the decommissioning of a nuclear power plant in the United States, where certain parts clearly were under very, very clear guidelines as to where, embargoes as to where they could be shipped and whatever, and whole processing plants sold. So the key thing here was the process of sourcing, buying and selling is very similar. Markets are very different, but actually a tech platform that applies to each of those is applicable. Now, when you then combine that with the social change we're seeing in terms of people wanting to reuse goods, there is nothing more eco-friendly than actually buying an antique, actually, or buying a second, pre-loved good or whatever. Then you start to see why this is such an exciting business and why it's had such a tremendously successful IPO. It's now valued over £1 billion in this last few months. But in that journey, we did all the things we talked on earlier on. You know, we brought new management team in to complement a very strong and passionate team. We went international, we acquired businesses. So that playbook really did play out very, very well.
Yeah. What were some of the challenges?
I think each of those vectors has challenges. So, you know, buying a business in Germany and integrating that, you know, has challenges because a lot of it is a people business at that end, and particularly the relationships with the auctioneers. It's a very personal thing. That is, so you've got to maintain that and keep that and get people committed to want to continue. The technology platform and scaling that, moving platform, putting a lot of the internal systems in place to match the scale that the business was coming to. And all these things have to happen in a relatively sort of, you know, in parallel, if you're going to maintain that sort of growth. So every single one of those things that you do in a business will have a challenge, and all you can do as a board is try to mitigate that by bringing in the expertise or having the discussions and debates that at least enable you to go in with your eyes wide open and understand what it is you're potentially facing. Now, there is an argument that it's a lot easier to do that as a private company, clearly, than it is as a public company.
But yeah. I mean, it's so as a business, it has a certain amount of appeal. Kind of thinking about how the social change, as you were talking about, that means auctioneering is becoming something people want to do, buying and selling. Everybody wants to do that. It's driving a really good social cause. But that sort of mix of technology, leading edge technology, and something which is part of what you might think of as being quite a traditional business, very people focused and relationship focused. Were there any particular challenges of that kind of?
Yeah, I think there were, because there are, and again, like everything else, I think there were some very traditional auctioneers who they love the theatrical nature of the auction, and, you know, standing up and doing that. And to them, actually, people bidding online from all across the world is a bit of an anathema. To the other people, and this is, I think, again, just how an industry evolves, who have set up their businesses, a new business right from scratch, purely as an online auctioneering platform. And so what they're doing is spending pretty much all their time on the thing that they're really good at, which is actually sourcing the goods, you know, getting the goods and the content for them to enable to actually sell it. But to give you another example, which I think, again, is surprising, but is just the way in which you can extend the opportunity. If you look at online retail returns, this is an industry and a business that has just gone crazy in the last 5 years. You know, people get 5 pairs of shoes that they may keep one, send 4 back. The logistics chain that we've seen and the logistics movement we've seen is just extraordinary as to how that works. But what we're seeing increasingly is these large retailers are using auction platform now as a means of then distributing those goods further down the supply chain into other areas. And so this is an area which, again, is an industry that's grown, didn't exist a few years ago, but has now become a core part of the whole logistics chain. And again, people like Auction Technology Group are in a great position to be able to use their platform to scale that sort of opportunity. So to me, you know, you couldn't probably find a better example of a technology-enabled business that is pivoted over the last, you know, 5 to 7 years as the one we've just been discussing.
And what do you look for when you're, question here from Robin O'Kelly, when you're sourcing non-executive directors for these sort of high growth businesses, what's the first thing you look for on their CV?
So when I'm sourcing it, well, the catch 22, which I myself faced when I was looking for my first chairman role, which I'll tell you about in a minute. The catch 22 is the NEDs. How do you get onto the NED sort of spectrum, I suppose? And actually, a friend of mine, Martin Fincham, has just published a book, came out this week, called The Novice NED. So I recommend that to people. Plug there for Martin. the reality is that what you should be looking for as an NED is you should be really looking for your first ones for learning. I mean, you've got to find, and dare I say it, when I started on this, who do you learn from? Actually, the person you probably learn the most from is the chairman, and working with the chairman and observing a good chairman, how a good, typically also a bad chairman, by the way, if you've got a bad chairman, observing things that don't work. But you do need to get to thinking about what is the skill sets you can bring. And I think there has been quite a big change, even in the last 5 years, in the types of people that should be attractive to boards. Very often they are people engaged in executive positions. They are involved in, and I personally am somebody who would recommend always to my senior execs that they take on one NED role in a business that broadens their expertise and skills. But they should have a skill set that they can bring to board. The big challenge you face is recognizing very often that you are, the clue's in the name, non-executive. So your job is not to run the business in terms of make the day-to-day decisions. It's to work with the management team and the rest of the board to have engaged debate and enable the business to evolve. But it's getting those first one or two under your belt that's important. And the story I had, so when I was approached my first chairman role, and I went through the process and everything else, and got on very well with the management team, got on very well with the backer. And then it came out and said, we really would like to go ahead with you, but you've not been a chairman before. And he said, well, how do you become a chairman? So you have to find your first opportunity and then build from that. And I very much took the approach as I did with my business career, which is, it's about learning, learn as much as you can, because you carry on learning. And that is also part of the fun of continuing to do it. If you don't continue learning or you're not relevant, then you don't get approached.
It's interesting that you encourage your executives to take on non-exec roles. Why is that? What do you think they get from that?
I think that I think by its very nature, a good exec becomes totally consumed by the business they're involved in, and that's actually what you want. As a board, that's what you want. You don't want the people being distracted. But the other side to that is that very often what you want is people to be able to learn and observe and take on things that may be applicable to their business, and to have those peer groups that they can talk to. And so what you don't want is teams of people, all they know is what they've done. And very often when you're buying into a business, whether it's a family-based business or whether it's a business that's been run by the same management team for many, many years, what you can on some occasions observe is literally all they know is what they know, because that's their experience. And so it's about how do you build and broaden your experience and learn to take things that could work for you in or from other opportunities and then apply them. And I think that just adds to the development of a business, and also, as I said, the quality of debate.
Mm. So learning's obviously important to you, and it sounds like you really encourage your non-execs to learn about the business as well. What sort of things do you expect of your non-execs in terms of how they get under the skin of the business?
I think if you can build the team correctly, then you are bringing diverse skills together. And so what you're looking for is, what I like to do is to try and have a sort of almost like a point person that can work with the team on the specific issues. If you've got a broad NED, some businesses will only have a couple of NEDs, and then the shareholders and management, and so your ability to be able to bring that mixture is somewhat limited. But ultimately, what you want them to do is to be able to contribute to and take on. And I encourage somebody to take a particular lead. It may be on customer engagement, for instance, that you want somebody to really understand the customer engagement plan and perhaps work with the teams beneath the C-level execs. Very often, I will try to get visibility of the rest of the management team occasionally through the year, whether that's through the strategy days or whether it's actually via a specific topic that you want to discuss at a board meeting, which means the CTO comes in, or whether it's the the head of commercial, chief commercial officer, whatever it is. But give them visibility of the board and make that part of the debate and part of the discussion in that particular session. That starts also to give you, I think, good material to then work with the CEO and the CFO, because you can give your observations on those things as well. So it's about being as transparent as you can. Now, there is a natural tension there. Some of the senior management don't want to have too much visibility across or down the organization, and vice versa. So it is a balance. But over time, I think that trust is built, and I think the value is built. And in my experience, if senior execs feel they're getting real value from a board, then they would engage in more and more.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of funny thing about being on a board, isn't it? Most boards, you sort of join the board with a tenure of kind of 3 years with a possibility to do another 3 years and another 3 years. But many board directors will sort of assume that once they've been hired, they'll be there for that full kind of 3 times 3 years term. And I just wonder if that needs to change, really. I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, I think the nominations, again, we have in public, we have nominations boards, we have nomination committees, and I think a lot of this does come down to having a full and open and frank review amongst the board, with the board, very often with a third party. I mean, in public boards I've been involved in, we've always had a third party engaged and working on that and working with us on that. In private boards, then it tends to be discussions, around the table. But I think you need to take time to have those discussions. And very often I found, NEDs will say, I don't think I'm adding real value here. I think I can do more. And then it's about addressing that and trying to either engage and make sure there is value, or actually recognizing, we've got the wrong skill sets here. We need to refresh. So I do think. I mean, I think if people are treated fairly and openly, then there's less issues. It's if people feel that they're being squeezed out for a reason they don't understand, or somebody's being brought on board for a reason that the management don't understand, and very often that can be somebody thinking, wait a minute, are they bringing on somebody that potentially could replace me, etc. They're all things that need to be sort of viewed and addressed one way or the other.
Yeah. I've got a question here in the chat, which I just was interested to ask you around, about the encroachment of, or the challenges of HR as IT starts to sort of almost impact on the labour market and make several professions more redundant. So, I mean, this particular question is around lawyers being made redundant by the use of technology. And I guess, that it's a challenge. It is a human challenge. I just wondered, you must have.
Oh gosh, the issue is, and I did actually read a report. Probably this may be what they're referring to. There's a report this week that said that up to 50% of jobs in the legal profession may be redundant in the next 10 years because AI essentially being used increasingly. I mean, that is not limited purely to the legal profession. I mean, it's something which applies, I think, to many. I mean, if you look at the way the Lloyd's insurance market still operates, it is absolutely ripe for a change into a global transactional market, electronic marketplace, in the same way as we've seen in currencies and we've seen in stocks. So I think there are multiple industries which will go through this inevitable change unless there is protectionism, which probably is not good as you go for global marketplaces. But the impact is everywhere. I mean, I was very heavily, obviously at Addison Lee, engaged in the whole worker status debate between the gig economy, which is just this enormous expansion, and actually the responsibilities of employees. And the legal profession has now decreased, and increasingly those protections are being given to employees. But these are all areas where there are fundamental shifts going on in terms of the way businesses need to plan and need to address. And so, you should always have an eye out, I think, longer term for what is going to be happening in an industry. But to be frank, the days of us joining an industry on graduating and still being in that industry by the time you retire, gone, long gone. And through that career journey, there are multiple changes that are going to be happening. And that's, I think that is the nature of the way in which today's businesses are sort of evolving, and the profession's the same. I mean, you could argue basically the same with medicine, and look how much of medicine is now being accelerated and driven and actually delivered, point of delivery, fundamentally differently. And I think one of the pros that we've seen, I was actually at a conference a couple of years ago where we were discussing how technology and processing power and the treatment of cancer is becoming inextricably linked. And it's a really interesting debate. We had people from Google there, we had people from Stanford, we had people from the major cancer hospitals in the States. But what became clear is that the massive improvement in computing power is directly driving the change in which healthcare will be delivered down to the individual level, down to the individual cell level at DNA. Can be changed because the processing power to come up with the right models are now happening in seconds or hours rather than weeks and months, which is what they were. And a good example of that is what's happened with the COVID vaccines. Those vaccines would not have been available in the timescales we've seen without just a massive change in the way in which those things are being processed. So, I think we have to stand back and everybody just needs to be aware that whatever they're doing today, unless they're getting, like me, closer to retirement, the chances are their industry is going to be fundamentally different in a relatively short period of time. And you need, if you've got children, as I do, all in their young part of their careers now, they've got to try and get themselves in a position that is going to be as flexible as possible.
Yeah. I mean, it's I was just reading. You were talking. You were referencing a book, and I was just reading Dan Bisa-Moyo's How Boards Work. Very good book, actually. One of the things she talks a lot about is about how boards need to really take on responsibility for driving forward some of these what might be considered more philosophical discussions, but that actually how our world of work is changing. How do you keep your boards focusing on those big sort of societal questions, but in a way that is, there's a tension, isn't there, between having good conversations around how businesses are impacting society and the way we work and staying focused on the bottom line?
Yeah.
How do you find that balance?
I think it's very difficult because ultimately we as chairmen or shareholders, very often we are shareholders in the business as well, we are being driven to make sure that the basics of the business is being delivered, that the business plan and the strategy and the finance and the funding, et cetera, are there. When you start talking about I think the strategy, that's when you start getting into some of those points we're talking about, what the strategic rationale for the business is. That's when you can, I think, start to be a little bit broader in terms of exploring those. And very often, if you talk about the auction technology example, the ability for that to play a role in the way society wants to try and be eco-conscious played a very important role. And so it is about blending that, and if you can, then if it all lines up, then that's great. Very often it doesn't, and there's the saying, you have to be strategic for at least one day a month type of thing. The reality is you've got to get those things in line, and if the business is not performing or is running out of cash, then actually focuses on short-term operations rather than whether the strategy said in 5 years' time we're going to be doing X, Y, Z. So it's about the balance, and I think different businesses in different states can afford to be more expansive or less expansive, but the reality is, from the board's perspective, to get the balance right.
Yeah. Do you put, a lot of your businesses are very transformational, and seem to have quite a social agenda too. Do you pick businesses specifically for that? Is that kind of high on your conscious?
I tend to be So I use a sort of fairly simplistic view, which is that there are three things I look at when I'm looking at opportunities or companies or whatever, and in no particular order, by the way. I mean, the first is the management team. What's the ambition? What's the team like? How open are they to working with an engaged board? And I've seen all extremes. I've seen at one extreme people who have been told they need to get a board and a chairman in, and they really don't want one, and they've got no idea why. Well, life's too short to get involved in that. That's not where I want to be. At the other end, you've got execs who think by bringing on a board that's got a lot more experience, it absolves them of responsibilities, and that's actually that's a tough one, because you can actually see this happen sometimes in the process. If your board is overly engaged, decision making gets devolved entirely to the board, and actually the C-level execs are not the ones running the business. And in fact, you see that balance change. So for me, it's the CEO, the team, the management team. How far can they go? How far can you stretch them? That's important. The second thing is the financing. And what's the state of the business? What's the backers like? And that very often is on the shareholder side as well. I arguably lost a public company in an acquisition because we had short-term hedge funds owning the stock, and they weren't long-term holders, and that enabled somebody to get in and get a holding in the business, which ultimately meant change of ownership. So it's not just about the private equity or growth equity or whatever. It's what's the quality of the ownership of the company look like, and are they going to back, and are they willing to back, and so checking that. And then the third thing is the point you were coming to, which what's the opportunity? Is it an opportunity that I'm interested in, excited by, and think I can add value to? And that becomes more a sort of I suppose a quality decision ultimately. But so they're the things I look at, and then ultimately you come up, and then you've got the chemistry. Does the chemistry work? Do people want you? Vice versa.
Yeah. Do you typically sort of have a time horizon for the positions that you take on as well, or do you?
I mean, private equity tends to work on a relatively clear scale. I mean, from the time of investment to exit, 4 to 5 years. It's that sort of period, and then add a year, because it always longer than you. It's always longer than you think. Always longer than you think. In the public markets, I mean, literally, you're there. You could be voted off at the next board meeting, the next annual general meeting, if you're in one of the hot seats. I was chair of the remuneration committee at AVG. That was always an interesting one annually. But the reality is that you're there for the period, and you're doing the job that you're being asked to by the shareholders. And so as long as you have the shareholders' support and commitment, then so be it.
You don't get voted off that often, though, do you? Come
on.
You don't.
No, you don't. No. If you've got a good chairman and you're doing the right job, then you should be okay. Yeah.
I'm keen to make sure we answer all the questions that come up, and there's a question here about technology and age discrimination. So just I guess is technology missing a trick by not by dismissing older candidates?
I think the way I would look at that is more to do with what are the relevant skills that you need to bring to bear, and it's a bit like gender as well, to be frank. It's how do you make sure that you are bringing together the best possible skills to bear for a particular company. So whilst technology, very often is at the bleeding edge, by the time it gets into main production, a lot of the things that you are looking to apply are pretty well worn. And so I don't believe that, and I suppose I'm an example of that. Age is not a determinant of whether you are able to continue. I think it's the relevance of the skills that you can bring. And so, if you are somebody who, for instance, is in marketing today, but you come from a very traditional direct selling business model where you're still using exhibitions, I'm taking extreme here as an example, then you really should be much more on what social media is doing, what your cost of acquisition is, because these are, lifetime customer lifetime value, etc. These are the KPIs and the tools that all relevant businesses should be doing. So the onus has got to be on you to stay current. And if you're not current, then you will have skill sets which apply to something else. And that may be, by the way, in a not-for-profit business, you may have organizational skills that somebody really, would benefit from. But it's important that you understand what is it you bring to the table. And the technology thing is an important part, and certainly understanding the impact is an important part. But as we move forward, that increasingly, anybody in executive career, that becomes a key part of what they're doing, or should be.
I guess the question is interesting the other way around as well, because a lot of boards who have got technology enabled or are transforming their business through technology often start to talk about whether they should have young people advising the board. I don't know. Do you have you experienced that, or do you?
And I think that's really valid. You need people who are experts in their field. I mean, I use the example. Two of my children have gone into industries that didn't exist 6 years ago. Social media and product data analytics. They didn't exist, so they weren't part of the way in which we thought about businesses. So if they become critical parts of what you're assessing as a CEO, for instance, where are you going to get your advice from? Your advice is not going to come from some 50-year-old guy that doesn't really understand that as being important, unless he is somebody that has been working on that. So it is the skill sets, but I don't have any issue at all with it's the best skills for the job that you've got to bring on board.
Yeah. And so we're sort of almost coming to the end of our time, but I'm wondering, do you have a favourite business that you've been involved in?
The answer is I've been very fortunate that pretty much every business I've been involved in, I've actually enjoyed. I've never in my working career had a time where I've said, oh my God, I've got to go to work. I mean, when I was flying 4 days a week, running international businesses, that wasn't great fun all the time, but the businesses themselves, as we expanded into Eastern Europe, as communism came down, or we expanded into Latin America, as those bits, they were all exciting things. So I don't think there's a favorite. I think there are some that are, on the face of it, much more intellectually stimulating than others. And I think, you mentioned Red Hat. I think Red Hat was intellectually very stimulating. I think AVG was also, but we also had an extraordinarily powerful board at AVG, which was made up of some really great characters. I mean, I used to thoroughly look forward to the board meetings, because not only were we covering relevant stuff for the company, but when we actually met up outside, we were able to discuss real relevance, which I know the management team benefited from as well, of much broader topics because of the people we had together. So, and then if you look at Alison, which on the face of it is it was a London minicab company that was facing the biggest challenge from a technology competitor ever, and how we transitioned that to a technology-enabled business. But we had all these issues about worker status and everything else. I mean, there were so many other factors that were having to be faced with that business. So in answer, I'm not put anybody off. I enjoyed all my businesses.
But it sounds like it's the sort of the complexity of the story that is of real kind of interest to you, how you pull it together. And yeah. James, you've arrived back, so I think that means
I'm back. Colin, I've got one question for you. I'm a potential non-exec or a newly arrived non-exec with huge amount of skills, which are very much wanted by a board, but I have no IT or very limited IT experience at all. How do I equip myself to be an effective member of that board?
I would look probably in your vastly extensive network, James, and I would pick out some people that you'd like to spend a bit of time with and get their views, on what some of the things that you should be up on. I would also spend time with the board that you're joining, with the CTO and or the chief product officer, or whatever it is, but also to get an idea of how they explain the business. That you don't want them to explain the technology to you, because that's not what you're there for. But you want to understand, how does this person interpret the technology into the business? And that will give you an idea, I think, in terms of how that works. But use your network and listen to people and seek out people to get their views. And that's worked for me. I get approached by quite a few people that are starting on this, and they just want, you have a network, they want to chat, people want to talk. And very rarely are you competing for the same role.
Well, Colin, as somebody who's being constantly besieged by messages from AVG encouraging me to grade up, I'm absolutely delighted to hear I've now got someone I can go to advise me on this.
Yeah, we sold that business, so yes, yeah.
Anyway, I never know what option to go for, but there we are. Look, Colin, that's been a hugely entertaining and interesting hour, and you've imparted a huge wealth of experience and knowledge on us all, and we've learned how to grow our business and how to manage it, and from the board's perspective, I mean, it is a major challenge now. I wouldn't have wanted to have been on the board of the post office, and having to take a view on whether the software being offered was an appropriate one. Really difficult.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. I'm sure that everyone else, I can't see them, would be now applauding loudly, but I certainly am, and we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Wonderful. Ali,
thank you for your facilitating this great conversation. And thank you everyone for joining us, and join us again on another Conversation With.
Thanks, James. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, everybody.